So my first slide is a land acknowledgement. We are all in Canada on Native land, and this is the homeland of the Anishinaabe, Innu, Unisu, Dakota, Inuit, Dene, and the Métis people. And I draw attention to water in this land acknowledgement, which relates very much to my presentation about the impacts of flooding on the Innu in northern Manitoba and several communities' displacement, on the impacts of flooding for diversion in Lake St. Martin and resource extraction with Shoal Lake. I'm on a journey of decolonization and look to meaningful partnerships with Native people and have been guided by many elders and knowledge keepers. And next slide, please. So thank you for this opportunity for the Open for Climate Justice. 2 days ago, the United Nations reported the concern that we're on track for 2.5 rather than 1.5 degrees warming, and that will result in catastrophe. So this is an important topic at this time. And in the news this morning, you're seeing Pakistan, you're seeing Nigeria flooding. So lots of these impacts are very visible today. And I'll bring this to Canada focus. This is a 2019 quote from Emergency Management Strategy for Canada that says the frequency and intensity of hazards are increasing. And my focus is largely on floods and the bottom, northern Canada, damage to seasonal ice roads. Next slide, please. There's lots of data to show that there's a higher risk for flooding in Indigenous communities in Canada. All of these are in open access journals. And I also have done 4 different videos, participatory videos with the communities of Little Saskatchewan and Lake St. Martin with Dr. Merle Ballard and Isabella Sumner to document their displacement, flooding and displacement impacts. So we've looked at how land is flooded around First Nations and used data that's available from the federal government on water. And next slide, please. The really connection between the hazard and the vulnerability of the system breeds the disaster. So vulnerability definition is how can we cope, resist, and recover? And for that, we need built infrastructure, we need adequate built infrastructure, we need ecosystems integrity. And that is really at risk in Canadian Indigenous communities. And I picture at the vulnerable system side, the ice roads. We have 122 communities, Indigenous communities in Canada that lack roads, access roads. I'm not going to say all-weather roads. Ice roads do not qualify as roads, and they may not exist under climate change. And that's a huge concern as these communities don't have other access. And also the fact that in the natural hazard area, that Indigenous communities have been placed in marginal lands, often flooded zones or swamps. And we see that in many communities. Also, they are downstream of diversions and dams. So Pegwith, for example, has been flooded for many years, and it's an ongoing reoccurrence. And yet they lack a ring dike. So every other community along the Red River has one, but that infrastructure is limited. Next slide, please, in Indigenous communities. So this is where we look at how displacement in Canada, and there's a map that shows just in Manitoba, and it's just beginning to show all the pattern of displacement. And this is reserves. This is not the initial from settlement, but based on reserves and displacement from those reserves because of hydroelectricity damming, from diversions, from forced relocations. And the top graph was using data to show flow data to show how flows have changed with control structures and increased and created a new normal that resulted in Lake St. Martin of flooding and having two communities to relocate. Next slide, please. And I'll bring attention at that point to the Indian Act as one of the reasons that reserves are targeted for diversions and dams is because in the Indian Act, they have been, they are under a land trust, so they are controlled by the federal government. And so it creates an actual natural resource curse. And it looks like it's very much creating a climate change curse for Indigenous communities. This is a map showing with Stats Canada data for Indigenous reserves, and then looking at the risks for different floodings from coastal storm surges, fluvial, and you'll see that it's visible. And I'll show you some more maps using open access data. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So these were done with a student, Ajrat Adigan, and published recently, showing how the availability of hospitals in Manitoba communities are connected with COVID-19 rates. So the inequity of the lack of hospitals in First Nations communities where only one First Nation has a hospital in Manitoba. So, as many of these communities are very large, whereas the smallest communities, Pinawa, and so many other small little towns of a few hundred have a hospital, whereas thousands in Island Lake and was in Garden Hill, in Cross Lake, these communities lack a hospital. So this shows the striking inequities that exist, the lack of infrastructure, and this is solely blamable on government. Governments build hospitals. Governments are not building hospitals in First Nations, and that's a great injustice. And this finding is obviously very statistically significant, and it shows the higher rates as a result. This is putting communities at risk for COVID-19, to other diseases, and for climate change, and the health impacts that result from that, but also the injury impacts from that. Next slide, please. The lack of road access, we showed you a picture of the ice road, which are with climate change less reliable. They were never reliable. They were never accessible in all seasons because there is breakup and freeze up as well, so you can't take a boat all the time, you can't take the road. There are big periods where there is no access. And this map shows how on the east side, so many communities are lacking all-weather roads, access roads, and so they're not able to access service centers, and that means government services, that means banks, suppliers. And this is a problem for housing. And we really see this in the housing poverty that exists on First Nations reserves. Not only is there not a bank in these communities that you can mortgage, the Indian Act also does not allow for banks really to provide mortgages. So CMHC is the loan source. So I denote in the bottom York Factory First Nation. It was moved to York Landing, and they had asked us to do a video with the youth to show their demand for an access road. And with their ferry had shut down for 3 months. They had no access into their community, and it was causing great stress and depression among youth, and health demands were not being met. So this shows the concerns. It was connected to COVID-19, statistically significant to COVID-19 rates. But what does this mean for climate change? Is the fact that in a wildfire, people can't exit the community easily by road, and flood events. So this was a concern for Wasagamak, which has no road and has no airport, and couldn't, with the forest fires, get out of the community easily. It was very delayed, and they were very at risk and suffered health consequences. Next slide, please. So you can see from this map, so the last ones were open access data, and I listed the data as PIMS and Indigenous profiles and Stats Canada. And this data shows a notional corridor. So this is the idea that University of Calgary is putting forward to really provide a resource corridor. And you can see also on this the amounts of winter roads in Manitoba on the east side, in the north, in Ontario, in the territories as well. So there's lots of winter roads, and the fact that this idea of a corridor is not directly accessing these communities. So using open data, we were able to determine what communities this notional corridor was going to access of the fly-in communities, and really only a few that are listed on the top here. So in the right-hand side map, you'll see that there's only a few of the 122 communities that are going to be accessed. So clearly, this is not about giving access to Indigenous communities and food security. My research was around whether it improves food security. First Nations community across Canada have 52% food insecurity, which is a huge injustice. And in northern communities, it's close to 80%. So definitely there are concerns that access isn't providing food security, and what is that going to mean without winter roads, and with the increasing prices due to COVID and other chain disruptions. In the bottom corner on the right-hand side, you can see what this notional corridor is doing. And that's focusing on the greenstone belts. And greenstone belts mean gold and precious metals, and lithium for our batteries, etc. So, my thinking is that people come first, and food is a basic need, and that is how we should be developing our roads, not to move more gas, to move more resources to the ports. So yes, let's focus on food security and not make it contingent on resource corridors. Next slide, please. Because we found that some of the highest rates, actually the highest rates for provinces, are in Alberta, which has lots of resource corridors. So there is a linkage to a natural resource curse with Indigenous communities, partly because of the Indigenous Act. And I show this slide, and I'm sorry the top got cut off because it has an important note that this is the work of Stuart Hill. Dr. Stuart Hill did a PhD with myself as co-supervisor in the Natural Resources Institute. And he developed this model to show how health and land has deteriorated under colonial rule. And the need, right, and that colonial policies are still in place, and that we have to do, we have to take action against these racist policies, against the Indian Act, and reconcile. But, reconciling without governance, land, or resources is only going to add to the climate chaos and the deterioration, decline in well-being. That we need climate action. We need to look at make Canada accountable for Indigenous equitable living and for climate change and extraction, and work towards self-determination and sovereignty. So that is key, and something that is on my decolonization journey, along with others like Stuart Hill and Craig Blacksmith. So thank you so much for your time.